Warren Davis started his video game career in 1982 as a designer and programmer. Needless to say, he got that career off to a great start as one of the creators of the game Q*bert. Still very active in the industry today, Warren has watched video games evolve from the early days to present. His experience includes working on Laserdisc games like Us vs. Them and helping to code the 256 color system. His enhanced video digitalization system was used in games like Mortal Kombat and NBA Jam. Over the years, he's worked on titles like Joust 2, Exterminator, T2 Judgment Day, and Revolution X featuring Aerosmith. Warren worked for Disney Interactive from 1995 to 2000, and for the last 15 years, he's been working on console games, edutainment titles, and pre-visualization software for films. We're so excited to have him on the show today. Hey, Warren, welcome to the Gamers Dominion.
Hey, Janice, how are you?
I'm doing well. We go way back, don't we?
We go back years.
We do. We have video games in common. We're panelists together. We're Magic Castle goers together. We have quite a history.
And we have the same last name, even though we're not related.
Exactly. Remember the moment? I think it was at San Diego Comic Con. One of our audience members were like, "Are you guys father daughter or related in some way?" And you're like, "No," but we could be.
We could be. Who knows? We didn't go back far enough.
You're so much fun, Warren. Thank you so much for being here.
It is my pleasure.
We have so many exciting topics to dive into. But first, I just want to know, how are you? Can you share with all your fans what you're doing lately? Because, you're an actor, you have such a rich video game history. What's going on these days?
I was traveling a lot. I was going to a lot of retro gaming events in the last couple of years. And this year, I'm sort of cooling it a little bit because I think it was over-traveled. And in fact, I'm going to be missing an event this weekend that if anybody's listening who is in Chicago, and if this is out there soon enough, this weekend at the Galloping Ghost Arcade in the Chicago area, they're having an unveiling of a game, the first game I ever worked on, even before Q*bert. Q*bert was my first game that was released, but before Q*bert, I sort of worked as a supplemental programmer on a game that was never released. And what they've found the ROMs, and they basically have got a working version of it that Doc Mack, who owns the arcade, is going to put up in his arcade, which is very exciting.
No way! That is so exciting.
So the artist who I worked with on Q*bert, Jeff Lee, was also the same artist on this game. They're calling it Argus, even though it went through many names. I guess when they released it and tested it, and it wasn't quite pulling in the cash they wanted, so they thought, well, maybe it's the name. So it went through many names, but Argus is the one that I think they settled on, and that's what they're going to call this.
Wow.
So anyway, and Doc invited me out, but I could not make it because I'm in rehearsals for a play. So unfortunately, I couldn't go to Chicago this weekend. But in answer to your question, what am I doing? That's one of the things I am doing now. I'm in rehearsals for a play that opens in April.
Oh, awesome! What can we know the title and when it runs?
Sure. It's called Currency, and it's an original play by a local playwright named Jenny Webb, and it's going to be at the VS Theater, the Versus Theater. I don't know how you pronounce it, but they spell it VS on Pico Boulevard here in Los Angeles, and it opens sometime in April. I'm not sure the exact weekend. It runs for about 5 or 6 weekends, so. We just got started, but I'm very excited. I'm really looking forward to it.
That is awesome. I was in theater when I was in college and did, and plays are still close to my heart. But I know what you mean about the over traveled. I definitely feel like I overdid it last year as well. So I'm cutting back as well. And speaking of our projects that are close to our heart, you mentioned that this project Argus went through many names and it's finally here. I mean, is that weird to feel and to see a game that you worked on that maybe you never thought was going to release finally come to fruition?
Yeah, I mean, it is weird because, it had its moment. It wasn't, they didn't produce it. And, I didn't feel as bad, I'm sure, as the programmer. His name is Tom Malinowski. He was the lead programmer, the designer of the game. And I just worked basically, doing little chores for him because I was new and I didn't know anything about making a video game. So that was sort of a little bit of my training, trial by fire, just doing little routines here and there.
Mhm.
But I'm sure he felt terrible when the game, was shelved basically. So I think
Sure.
he must be thrilled. And again, I wish I was there to see him. I haven't seen him in years. One of the beautiful things about going to a lot of these retro gaming events is that I have been running into the people I used to work with, who I literally haven't seen in years. A lot of them are still in Chicago. Um, some of them are in the West Coast, but again, I don't often get to see them. So seeing those guys and reconnecting with those guys has been tremendously rewarding.
You mentioned that Argos was kind of your pre-training leading up to the game that I feel we've all heard of or been a part of or watched in some sort of capacity. That's Cubert.
Yes, I've heard of
I
it. You'd be surprised how many people have not heard of it, though. It's funny, a lot of people in my life don't know that I did Qbert. They don't know that I worked on it in any capacity because I don't talk about it usually unless it comes up in conversation. But every now and then one of my friends is like, hey, this is Warren. This is my friend Warren. He did Qbert. And it's always, very humbling when they go, what's that? Never heard of that.
But
So
there must be those
that's
moments where you have the opposite side of the coin, and then that person freaks out. It's like, whoa, you did Cubert, right?
Yeah, that has happened as well. It's equally odd, It's just, listen. I've said this many times, but it's hard to explain the feeling of having done something that people appreciate so much. It's an extraordinarily rewarding privilege, and that's the way it feels. It always has. So I'm very, very grateful just to have had the opportunity to do it, and it certainly never gets old to have something you've done be appreciated.
Sure, absolutely. Well, could you take us back to that moment, when the game was conceived, by you? Like, how did you and Jeff Lee come about Cubert?
So I had just come off of this game Argus, which, again, it had been shelved, and it was like, all right, we're not working on that anymore. And the reason I was hired was to make video games. This is over at Gottlieb Amusement Games, Gottlieb being one of the old family-owned pinball companies back in the early 20s, and then it was bought by Columbia Pictures in the late 1970s. So we were no longer family owned, although some of the Gottliebs were still involved and would show up once in a while to say hello. But anyway, I was hired to make video games, and without a project, anymore, I suddenly was like, okay, Warren, make a game, which I had never done. Although I will say I did have a little bit of a history with computers and games in school. I always, leaned towards game-related projects in school. That being said, never made a video game. And one day I was just looking at one of the other programmers' screens, and he was messing around with this Escher pattern. We call it the Escher pattern because it's sort of the illusion of cubes. It's actually a six-sided figure. If it's shaded correctly, it looks like a cube. And he filled the screen with this pattern. So it just went from edge to edge. And I walked by and I looked at that, and he was doing something weird where he was erasing parts of the foreground to reveal something behind it. That's all he was using it for. And I looked at it and I thought, wow, if you created a pyramid out of these cubes and something fell on the top and bounced, every time it bounced, it would have a choice of going left or right. Well, that's a bit. That's a binary digit. And if you had 7 or 8 rows, it would fit within a byte. Of course, we know bytes, us programmers. So I thought, wow, with one random byte, I could determine the path of something falling on this pyramid. So I really just started out making a programming exercise just for myself. I was like, you know what? I'm going to try and program randomness and gravity. I basically borrowed those building blocks of pyramid parts, I should say cube parts, and I turned it into a pyramid. And then I got Jeff Lee involved, and I asked him for a round ball, something very simple, and he created that for me. And then I just programmed the ball bouncing down the pyramid with a random path. So there was no game, there was no thought of a game. But when people saw that, they looked at it, well, that looks really cool. Just the pyramid floating there and the balls falling down, and it had a very three-dimensional look. People were like, that's cool. So I was like, okay, well, what's the next logical step? Well, you've got this pyramid. The next logical step is to have a character, jumping, hopping all over these cubes. So I went back to Jeff Lee and I said, listen, do you have any characters you've designed that aren't being used? And he showed me a bunch, and I kind of liked the one with the long orange snout. He looked most like a player character to me. And I was like, can I use him? He's like, yeah, sure. There were a lot of programmers. There are not many artists. I think maybe there might have been only one other artist besides Jeff. And sometimes the programmers did their own art. But it was definitely a programmer-centric place to work. And so Jeff may have had ideas for these characters in a game, but unfortunately, as just an artist, he had no way of implementing his vision. So I asked him for those characters or that one character, and he said, sure. So that was the next step, and I had Q*bert. Well, he wasn't called Q*bert, of course, but I had this guy jumping around the pyramids, and I remember one night in particular. So we had a great vice president of engineering. His name was Ron Waxman. Passed away last year. Was so grateful. I actually got to see him just a couple of weeks before he passed. I was in Chicago a number of times last year. Got to visit him, and he was wonderful. He and Howie Rubin, who was the vice president of marketing. They were sort of the guides. They put this team together. They were the ones who basically had to convince management that, yes, we can create a video game department. I won't get too much into it, but the whole history of how Gottlieb even got a video department is kind of interesting. Anyway, because we came in late in the game. They didn't start a video department until a couple of years after the video boom had begun. Anyway, so, I was sitting late one night, and Ron Waxman, who's a very large man, and he used to smoke cigars, and he would sit behind me and just watch me work, which, if you can imagine, that's very unnerving.
I don't think I can.
He got this very large, and he had a really gruff demeanor. I mean, he was very deadpan and just sort of gruff seeming, but he was actually the most beautiful, wonderful soul. But he would sit there behind you, breathing heavily. You'd hear him breathing, you'd hear him smoking, and he would just sit there. And I'm working away, blah, 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 doing my thing. And just out of nowhere, he goes, what if the cubes changed color when he lands on them? And I'm like, yeah, that's a good idea, sure. So that is sort of, in my mind, that's the moment when it actually became a game where you actually had a goal. The development of it just sort of continued in that way. It was, I call it a very evolutionary game. It did not start off with a design at all. It was, okay, we did this. What's next? All right, I'll do that. What's next? I'll do that. And, sometimes like Jeff was invaluable as a collaborator. He would throw ideas at me, and, many of them were not ideas that I liked or took. And every now and then he'd have an idea, and I'd be like, that's awesome. Dave Thiel, who did the sounds, also, I just gave him carte blanche to do what he wanted with sound. And he's the one who came up with Q*bert's voice. And that was because they had this chip that made phonemes, and phonemes being individual parts of speech.
Yeah.
So this chip was very crude, and the idea was it was supposed to speak English, but you'd have to stitch the phonemes you wanted together to get it to say something in English. But it sounded horrible. It sounded robotic, and Dave just hated the sound of this chip. So he came up with the idea of just having a random number generator and literally just throwing out random phonemes. And that is what Q*bert's speech is.
Wow.
Why, it's Q*bert. What brings you here, neighbor?
What's he saying, Felix?
Stand by. My Q*bertese is a little rusty. Ralph's gone turbo.
Just hearing you talk about that open format, that open sandbox type of development is really, really refreshing, because I've heard so many other developers recently discuss how they almost feel, forced, or, okay, we have this idea, now let's force it into a first-person shooter or a role-playing game. And it's so cool to hear that it was like a snowball, or you just melted together.
Yeah, well, to their credit, both Ron Waxman and Howie Rubin created an environment which was like a playground. I mean, they knew that they didn't know what a great video game was. They knew that, and they admitted it. And so they brought in people, and they basically let everybody just roam free. It wasn't without its downside. I think there were some people who worked for maybe a year and a half on a game that went nowhere. So sometimes obviously you didn't get a success out of that, but I think the environment they created was certainly fun for us. I mean, we were working away from the main pinball factory in Northlake. We were in Bensonville. And it was just the video game department, which was fairly small. And it was very much like a think tank environment, very loose. I remember Howie Rubin would come in the middle of the day. And we had, by the way, a huge manufacturing plant because basically video game makers, they were manufacturers. They were pinball manufacturers originally. And so everything was about feeding the plant, keeping the plant going, right? And we were in this manufacturing facility that hadn't started yet. So the idea was they were going to build video games in this manufacturing plant, but they hadn't started yet. The first game they actually built internally was Reactor, a game made by Tim Skelly. So that was about to hit the production line. But this big manufacturing plant was completely empty. And Howie Rubin would come in the middle of the day and go, "Everybody, stop what you're doing. We're going out in the plant and play football."
No.
And he would make us, probably against our will, go out into the plant and toss a football around for a little bit.
Wow, that's so cool. It's just so random, but probably, like you said, good for you all to just break the chain.
Yeah, but that's the kind of environment it was, and it was very much listen, try whatever you want. Think outside the box, come up with what makes you happy and stuff like that. It was really an amazing place to work. Now things changed there later.
Of course. Doesn't it always?
Yeah, because there, well, that's a little bit later. I'll maybe, if we get to it, I'll get there. But back to Q*bert, so Q*bert was in development for about 4 months, I would say, it took to get the game finished. And
did you know then that it was gonna go from your fingertips to the arcade, or did you know its potential?
No, I didn't. And listen, I was new to what I was doing, and all I was trying to do is do something that I liked, make a game that I thought was fun. A lot of people asked me about the controls. Defender and Robotron and Stargate had been out, and those games were so crazily complicated. I was a terrible player at those games, and I was like, I want to do something simple. I mean, if anything, Pac-Man was kind of my role model for Q*bert. Just one joystick. It's that simple. And I somewhat glibly would tell people, they'd say, well, what about the controls? And I said, well, I wanted to make a game where you could hold a drink in one hand and still play the game.
I love it. You can still relax, with your coffee or your soda and, just casually play. I love that idea.
Or your rum and Coke, which is really what I was thinking. But, half true, I suppose. Anyway,
so there it was. It's your fingertips. I mean, how did it explode into the arcade scene and then into the animated, scene and then Wreck-It Ralph?
Right. The first thing you do when you make a game is you put it out on test, especially an arcade game. You put it out on test because you want, the company wants to see, is it going to make any money? As I said before, we were manufacturers. We actually sold the games, the big stand-up cabinet with the game in it. So you might think, well, what do we care if it makes money or not in the arcades? Well, if it makes money in the arcades, then people want to buy it. So we make more and build more. So we put it out on test, and we had a few arcades. I mean, all the game makers back then had, their little favorite arcades where they'd stick a game in, a new game. And the arcade culture back then, this was 1982, the arcade culture was just at its peak. You have no idea. I mean, arcades sprung up everywhere. There was an arcade within spitting distance no matter where you were in the country. And,
wow.
A new game always gathered attention. They'd wheel in a new game and people would cluster around it and they'd check it out and they'd watch the attract mode, which is the screens when nobody's playing, and they'd just check it out. They'd pop a quarter in. So I would go to these arcades where the game was on test, and I would just sort of kind of fade back a little and just sort of hang out and watch people play,
That
And I
must have
remember,
been the most surreal feeling, like seeing something that went from your fingertips, your programming eyes, to now in the hands of players actually curiously discovering it.
oh yeah, it was quite unreal. I mean, I imagine it's very similar to a filmmaker, sitting in the back of a theater watching an audience see his movie for the first time. I learned a lot from watching people. Like sometimes people would put a quarter in, and they would literally just jump right off the pyramid because they have a tendency to push on the joystick, and that's what you do. So, you lose a life. Sometimes people would lose 3 lives instantly on one quarter, and then they'd walk away. And I and other people from Gottlieb would be like, "Oh boy, are we in trouble? Are people gonna?" But the interesting thing is that they would come back, and they would try it again. And if they saw somebody who was playing and doing it well, then they'd be like, "Okay, the problem must be me. It's not the game." And they give it another shot. And for whatever reason, people embraced it. And so we were very encouraged not only by watching people play it, but also by the coin returns. It collected well, so we were very encouraged.
And
The
how
other
cool that it carried that thread that you mentioned, where it brought gamers together, where one might see another player doing something slightly differently, and then that catches their attention. They're like, "Oh, I'm going to try that," and it's that thread that still exists today, where we watch each other play and learn from each other.
That's absolutely, yes. I mean, it's a very big part of games. It's a social part of games, even one-player games, is that you watch other people play and you're sort of competing with them just on your own in not a direct way, but an indirect way. You're competing because you want to get that high score. That's the whole purpose of the high score table. You want people to show what they've achieved, so other people be like, "Wow, I want to try and get that." Anyway, there's a whole psychology to arcade games, or as we sometimes would call them, quarter suckers, because really that was we were not crass capitalists saying, "Geez, we just want to collect money." I think most people who make games wanted to make good games. They were interested in it not necessarily as an art form, but just as a matter of pride, as something that's fun for people and that's entertaining. But we also knew that, listen, we don't have jobs unless people play these games and put money in it. So there was,
Right.
tuning a game. I mean, I learned a lot about tuning a game on Qbert because I'd never done it before. By the way, we also did focus groups. Those things where you invite people into a room and you have a one-way mirror, and somebody sort of asks them questions and has them play the game and then talks to them about it. We actually did those. And I sat on the other side of the mirror and watched these focus groups. That was a trip and a half. And I actually did this a number of times throughout my career. I did it for a number of games. But this particular time, I found that people would play the game, and you could see on their faces how much fun they were having. I mean, they were loving it. They were having a great time. But then after, when you asked them questions, they'd be very cool about it. They'd be like, "Yeah, it was okay. I mean, So it was interesting to see that sometimes what people say does not match their behavior, and I think the behavior is more telling.
Yeah, that still happens to this day. I know a gamer personally that I watched him play Diablo, and he was having a blast, and he was like, I could just tell, like you said, from his face, and he was very successful in the game. He ended up making a lot of money in it or getting the best gear or what have you. And when I asked him afterward, just like you said, he's like, "Yeah, it was all right." It blew me away that, like you said, his vocal report was so different than sitting next to him watching the experience.
Yeah, this is human nature. It's you learn a little bit about human nature when you watch people. Anyway, so we did this, these focus groups, and the feedback that I got from not only focus groups but watching people, and also from the people who played it in house, was that it was too hard. People just found it very challenging. So I kind of scaled back on it, on tuning, made it easier, and I kept doing that. And then, of course, when it got released, within a week, I think we got reports that people were playing it all the way through every level that was programmed, because it gets to a point where the tuning of it doesn't change. It just stays at the same level. It doesn't get harder. And then I just sort of kicked myself and I said, I made it too easy. So I immediately embarked on retuning it, and that process resulted in what became Faster, Harder, More Challenging Qbert, which wasn't intended ever as a sequel. It was just really me sort of retuning the game, reshuffling the way it plays, and then Jeff added a new character called Cubertha, who's like a female Cubert who takes the place of Coily at some point. And we had a new game, but we had it so soon after Cubert was released because it didn't take me long to retune, and people were still learning Cubert, so it was too soon to release it, and then they shelved it. And I always kind of thought, well, why didn't they just hang on to it for a year and then release it? And I guess I will never know the answer to that question because it just never got released. But I had the ROMs, and then when I was working at Disney in the mid-'90s, I met a guy who worked with me, Fred Susukian, and he turned me on to these people who ran the MAME project. And he said, yeah, they have Cubert emulated on MAME. And since really the hardware for Cubert and Faster, Harder, More Challenging Cubert, identical hardware. In fact, a lot of the Gottlieb games had identical hardware. That's kind of why Argus was able to be reconstituted, because the hardware is the same. I released those ROMs to MAME. So now everybody who has the MAME emulator can play Faster, Harder, More Challenging Cubert. And I'm very pleased about that because that's sort of my favorite Cubert. That's the Cubert that I like personally.
Sure. It offers the challenges. I think you wanted it in it originally, but you got, I think, compassionate toward those that you said, you could tell maybe it was too hard at first. But I agree with you. Going back to your original, hey, we want it to be a little challenging, right?
Right. Game players in the field are always going to be better than me. That's the lesson I learned, is that, no matter how good I think I am, there are going to be people out there who kick my ass, and they're going to be much better.
Sure.
So, you should program the game for them.
Now, Cubert, it went on to showcase in Saturday Supercade. It went on to debut in Wreck-It Ralph. I mean, do you attribute that to just the uniqueness of what Cubert is and the generated speech that he does? I mean, what was it that snowballed this?
Well, I think it was a lot of things. I think, he's a cute character. And listen, Jeff Lee is an amazing artist. The way he could throw a bunch of pixels together and bring it to life is just phenomenal. And, his work in Argus, this game that's released at Doc Mac's place, he made little pedestrians that were like 7 pixels tall. And they each had their own personality. And it's amazing. So what he was able to do with pixels was phenomenal. So, Cubert, even though, it's a crude by today's standard thing, he had a personality. I think people responded to that. I think also the humor in the game, the cartoon balloon, the falling, the way he speaks, all of these things I think contributed to the character being lovable. And since people love the game, it's hard to imagine now how popular he was in his time. And Gottlieb, to their credit, they jumped on the marketing thing. There were so many products. There was a Cubert breakfast cereal. Anything you could slap Cubert on, playing cards. There was a Cubert board game. There was a Cubert lunchbox. They did everything.
Warren, what was that like, seeing your game on all of this?
I was thrilled just for the opportunity to do this. This was like a dream come true for me, and it was my first game. So I was just thrilled that it was successful. I did not really make any money off of it, nor do I own the rights to Cubert. But really, that has never bothered me because I got to do it. Listen, when I was studying computers, when I was in high school, I had a choice between studying film or computers, because those are the two things I wanted to be, a director or a computer guy. And the thing I loved about computers was their capacity to entertain. Now, this is at a time where computers were the size of a room, and you would, punch your program on punch cards. So, this was pre-PC. And I was even then thinking these devices have the potential to be entertainment, devices. So when video games first came out, I was like, oh my God, how do you get to make a video game? I didn't know who you had to be. I thought you had to be somebody important or really smart or something. I just didn't know. So it was kind of ironic that, when I graduated from college and I went to work for Bell Laboratories for a while, but I became disenchanted. They had me moving around the country and I was getting a little tired of it. And I decided to move into Chicago and become an actor. because I wasn't making very much money as an actor. In fact, I hadn't even been trained as an actor. But I started looking at the Sunday paper at the want ads. That's how I found this job. They just advertised in the Sunday paper. Video game programmers wanted.
Wow.
And just I was like, well, I doubt that they'll take me, but what the hell? I can't let this opportunity go by. And so nobody was more shocked than me that they even offered me a job. After the interview with Ron Waxman, I was almost convinced that they wouldn't offer me a job because, as I said, he had a very gruff demeanor. And I remember him asking me things like, so do you have a computer at home? Now, of course, the home computers, were very new back then. This was, the end of 1981. So the PC had just been released that year. And I said, no, I don't. I use them at work, so I don't really need one at home. And but every question he asked just made me feel like I was an idiot and didn't deserve to be there. No, but that was just his way. That was just his way. And I didn't let it faze me. To my credit, I just rolled with the punches. I didn't take it personally. I didn't, but I just didn't think I was going to be offered a job. Because I was so disillusioned with Bell Labs and just the engineering type of environment, I really thought hard about it. I was like, no, I've decided to become an actor. I'm not going back to engineering.
Interesting.
Which I just kicked myself in the head that I even thought that. But I kept saying, oh, I'll just send this resume and I don't have to take the job. And then I was like, oh, I'll just go on this interview. I don't have to take the job. And then I was like, well, I could just work here a little bit. And if I don't like it, I can quit.
I think video games, there's something about them like that.
Well, yeah, they were becoming so popular, but it wasn't the popularity of them that it was attractive to me. It was just the ability to entertain. It was the ability to take this hardware and software device and turn it into something that people could use for entertainment. That's what really attracted me to it.
Right. Now, when I saw Wreck-It Ralph, I immediately thought of you when I saw Q*bert for the first time on screen. Did they do Q*bert justice? Did you like his role in the film?
Yeah, well, it was it's a little insulting that Q*bert is this homeless character that's sort of forgotten and
oh no,
pushed by the wayside. But I couldn't really disagree. That was sort of the case. Whereas Pac-Man and Donkey Kong and Frogger were constantly like, if people talked about video games, it's almost they would always go like, well, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, and Frogger, but they would never mention Q*bert. So Q*bert did not get a lot of love for a while there. So I think it was a nice reintroduction of the character, and I was actually very, very happy about that. Did very well for Gottlieb. I don't know the number that they built. I never have been a guy to memorize minutia like that, but yeah, it was a very successful game for them. I think the only other really successful game Gottlieb had in its little brief tenure as a video game company, because it was shut down in 1984, I believe. It didn't last very long. Coca-Cola bought Columbia Pictures, and then apparently they didn't want to have a pinball company, so they shut it down. But the only other real successful game they had was Mach 3, which was a Laserdisc game with flying footage and then computer graphics superimposed over it.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Lastly, is there any way that people can follow you? I know you're again an actor in TV and plays and films, and you're still involved in video games. How can people follow either your website or your Twitter or what have you?
I am notoriously bad at self-promotion, and I have a personal Facebook page. I don't usually, I prefer people don't friend me if they don't know me, but I do have a Twitter account. I don't use it very often. People are welcome to follow me on Twitter. It is at Warren Davis 29.
And IMDb. Everything we need to know about you, right?
Yeah, I have an IMDb page, so if people want to see my my acting credits, you're welcome to go there and take a look at it.
Your Wikipedia page.
I have a Wikipedia page, that floored me. I remember somebody told me about that. I was like, what?
Very proud of that, Warren. That is awesome.
But listen, if people, and I do love to hear from fans. If people want to contact me through Twitter or Facebook and send me a message, oh yeah, that's lovely.
Awesome. Well, you are lovely, and thank you so much for being here.
It has been my pleasure, Janice, as always. And let's see each other sometime. It's been a really long time.
Absolutely.
I'm sure I'll see you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Warren.
All right. Take care.
Take a cue from the cube. Hey, it's Cubert. Take a cue, me and you. And Cubert, me and you. And Cubert, me and you. And Cubert. We're going to poke Cubert's favorite down in Cubert.